Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. My name is John McGovern, and I lead the accessibility practice at the WT Group. And the town of Erie has retained us for a 3-year project to help it evaluate its existing parks, facilities, and public right-of-way for compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Tonight's session is the first of what will be 6 community engagement events spread out over the 3-year period. We will also supplement these events with a survey that citizens can take and express their own preferences and priorities for accessibility. We do have some staff from the town here today. So Town of Erie staff, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself. Lori Wisner.
Yes, Lori Wisner. I'm risk manager and ADA coordinator for the town of Erie.
Am I on the camera? I'm Charlie Leroy, Business Services Supervisor in Parks and Recreation.
And members of the public.
Yes, hi, I'm Carol Bogles and I'm a resident in Erie.
And Tatum, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Tatum Story. I'm a project manager, WC Group. My background is I have a master's in social work. And I used to do consulting for Title I of the ADA. And so I've been here doing Title II consulting with John for coming up on 2 years.
Then on the next 2 slides. So skip to the next one, thanks. So this is the scope of work for year 1. This started mid-year 2022 and carries on through mid-year 2023. Project management will have, so that's a series of meetings, usually monthly, where we'll talk about what we did the prior month, what we're going to do the coming month, and address any issues that arise in between. We're also conducting in this first year a policy and program review to make sure that public-facing policies are consistent with Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act regulation issued by the Department of Justice. The third task is to audit the town website. So a subcontractor of ours, ProNet Source, is handling that. And part of that work carries over into the second year as well. We're also drafting a program and policy report that will include recommendations for the town regarding its public-facing policies. What we'll try to do here is identify things that might be absent, like perhaps a policy about other power-driven mobility devices in parks, or policies that might need to be tweaked, everything from recreation registration processes to reserving a site for an event, or perhaps a service animal policy. Community engagement, again, is a part of year 1 and year 2 and year 3. This is a requirement by the Department of Justice, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later on tonight. We also, in this first year, audited all of the existing parks and facilities operated by the town and prepared site reports that identify deficits for each. We're also preparing a preliminary transition plan with cost references. The transition plan we'll talk about in a couple of more slides, but it's really just a phased schedule of work that the town will accomplish. Task Tracker is a tool for after 2025. It's a way for the town to track work that occurs on the transition plan. And then last but not least, we put together a transition plan final report at the end of each year, and then a cumulative report in 2025. In year 2, again, project management, the town website continues to be audited there. We'll have other community engagement opportunities. We will, in year 2, start auditing public right-of-way, so that's sidewalks and curb ramps at intersections. We'll again continue the transition plan with cost references, Task Tracker as well, and then we'll include a year 2 final report. And then last but not least, In 24 to 25, we'll do the third year of work, so that will include project management, again, community engagement. Public right of way audits and reports, the transition plan, but a cumulative one that includes all 3 years. Task tracker, again, that includes all 3 years. And then a cumulative final report for town leadership to review. I should have said at the beginning, we've got the right size audience to make this as interactive as we want. So please don't hold your questions to the end. If you have any questions or comments, just raise your hand or just shout at me.
I do have a quick question.
Great.
Are we talking here mostly audits or implementation as well of what we're finding?
The transition plan that we'll provide will include recommendations for implementation.
And when is that happening? Starting year one, or is that
That's a good question.
after year?
There will be some things that we identify that we'll call low hanging fruit. There are things that the town can do with current human and fiscal resources. So looking around the room. There's a garbage can over there by that door. It's possible that that could be in maneuvering clearance for someone who uses a mobility device. So that's a simple awareness thing for staff to make sure that garbage cans aren't by doors, or at least if they are, they're closer to where the table with the snacks are. So simple things that don't really require any dollar output, but are really more of a staff awareness and training opportunity. So some of that could certainly be in there. The next slide talks about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think everybody has some level of awareness about the ADA. It became effective for the town on January 26th of 1992. It was signed into law by President Bush the same day, July 26th of 1990. And it's different from earlier federal civil rights laws that protected the rights of minority groups. So it's modeled after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of a variety of characteristics, including gender, race, religious belief. It's also modeled after Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, but only for towns that receive federal funds, and only in the program that benefits from federal funds. So Congress in the 80s started thinking, we really don't want to make this something that only attaches if the town receives federal funds. So the big difference in the ADA compared to the earlier statutes is that regardless of whether a state or a county or a city or a town or a special district has ever received federal funds, they are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of disability. So Title II is the part of the ADA that is the second bullet point on the slide up here. And it applies to the 89,000 units of state and local government across the country. Above that is employment. Title I addresses employment. The rules in Title I are different, and Title I is not in our scope of work for the town here. But in Title I, it's easier to draw the line and say you're not going to provide certain types of supports. My own opinion also is that Title I has been the least effective of the portions of the ADA. In 1990, when the ADA was signed into law, the percentage of people with disabilities who were unemployed or underemployed was 67%. Today, it's only changed by 1 percentage point, 66%. So I think it's not been as effective as it could have been. The big success story, though, has been towns. Towns have bought into the ADA, they understand the concept. Towns want people who have disabilities to have access to the same kind of programs and services and facilities that people who do not have a disability enjoy. So I think Title II has been a big success story. Title III is the third bullet point on the slides. And it addresses the more than 7 million privately owned businesses. So the local coffee shop, your favorite restaurant, the hotel I'm staying at, the car rental dealership, the CPA firm that you use, the bank that you do business at. All of those are Title III entities, and those too are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of disability. Very infrequently do Title III entities come forward and say, we want to voluntarily comply with the ADA. And again, that's exactly the opposite with towns. Towns willingly pick this up, as the town of Erie did. Last but not least was telecommunications in Title IV, and I'm looking around for my cell phone that I put it way over there. This is a good example of part of the ADA that maybe to a certain extent is obsolete. In 1990, not everybody had a smartphone. Not everybody had a cell phone. But today, certainly, the majority of most populations do. So if I have a question and I'm a person who's deaf or hard of hearing, and I have your text number, I can text you if you're a town employee, and we can carry on a conversation, and I can get the information that I need. Those methods weren't available in 1990. On the next slide, talk a little bit more about Title II. It does broadly apply to all town of Erie services, parks, and facilities. Congress wanted to make it clear that everything that a town provides, and this just makes sense. Towns are funded with property taxes from its residents and businesses. So Congress wanted to make sure that there's a higher bar that has to be met by the town. There is one crystal clear piece of the ADA. There are a lot of other pieces that are a little bit on the vague side, but one thing is clear. Design and construction of new sites must be fully compliant. So whether it's a bank, whether it's a town facility, whether it's a park, it does have to meet completely the 2010 standards and any Colorado requirement that are more stringent. There's also a requirement for existing sites. So existing sites do have to have the access audit conducted, and they do have to have a transition plan, which again is a phase schedule of retrofits. We also use smart practices a lot. Smart practices are design features that are not yet a part of a final federal standard or a Colorado standard. So a good example is power door openers, which I believe the community center has a power door opener, doesn't it?
Yes.
That's not a requirement. The requirement is that the door be able to be open without too much pounds of force. So the way a community could choose to address that is they have John, the maintenance person, every day use a door pressure gauge to determine whether or not the door could be easily opened and whether or not it swings closed too fast. We've all been hitting the heel by a door closing up. Or in the alternative, instead of putting me out there at the door every day, spend the $11,000 or $12,000, buy a power door opener, install it, and maintain it. So again, it's not a requirement, but it's really a smart practice. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of the policy and program related pieces. A key to the ADA is that the town and all of the other 89,000 units of state and local government have to make their programs available in the most integrated setting. That's defined as the setting in which people with and without a disability interact together. So it's a good training opportunity for staff, in particular in parks and recreation programs. So staff can learn how to facilitate interaction between somebody with a disability and somebody without a disability. Another key is that the town is required to make modifications to support participation by a person with a disability in a program. So some of the examples in the regulation and in the statute itself of what those modifications are include additional staff training, a different staff ratio, so more staff for the program participants, a sign language interpreter, removing architectural barriers at sites. Home visits is actually listed as a site or as a type of modification, and certainly a type of local government or a service of local government has been doing home visits for decades, and that's libraries. I think you could also argue that what we saw a lot of towns do in 2020 and 2021 with virtual participation and virtual programming constitutes a form of home visits as well. One of the other requirements, and this is important for towns today, is to make sure that contractors and concessionaires who, again, are using taxpayer paid for property do not discriminate on the basis of disability. So if I own John's Zumba class and I contract with the Erie Community Center to run Zumba classes here, and if an Erie resident comes in and brings their child who's on the autism spectrum, then I have to adapt to that, and I have to provide supports because I'm using town resources to conduct this program for the town. Last but not least, and this is a nuanced or subtle type of requirement, the town has to make certain that the processes that a person with a disability has to go through to participate are not different or more difficult than those that a person without a disability has to go through. A good example here from another state is a program registration form in a recreation department that said we will provide modifications to support people with disabilities in our programs. But then to get that, you had to register and then call the director of Parks and Recreation. Nobody else has to call the director of Parks and Recreation when they register. And a lot of people are put off about the concept of going to City Hall. So that kind of language in a form is automatically going to exclude some people. Might be a small number, but it's an unlawful exclusion under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Say a quick clarifying question. So are you saying, as an example, any programs facilitated here at the community center under ADA, any of the Zumba classes need to be able to accommodate all of those needs?
I wouldn't say that,
Okay,
but they have to be open to inclusion. You can in a program setting. So for example, there's a karate class going on next door. If that's beginning level karate, and I wouldn't be able to tell you whether it is or not from looking, but if it is, then I think that that's the kind of program that would be open to everybody, whether I'm deaf or hard of hearing, use a mobility device, have a cognitive impairment and so forth. But if it's the fourth level up and it's more competitive in nature, then there may not be an opportunity for all to be included. But there are, at the upper levels of competitive sport, there are wrestlers who are deaf and hard of hearing. There are basketball players who have Tourette's syndrome. There are many other players who have other health conditions like diabetes, for example. So that certainly diabetes rises to the level of a disability. So does a seizure disorder. So I wouldn't say all, but at that beginning level, I just watched my granddaughter play soccer this weekend. They're not playing soccer. There's one little girl drawing in the dirt. 3 kids are around this table like that's the ball. They're all kicking each other in the shin trying to kick the ball. I don't think it would be too hard to include somebody even who uses a wheelchair in that kind of a scrum at that early level. So it's a person by person analysis. And one of the requirements, and this will be part of what we provide to the town in our program report, one of the requirements is that there's an assessment. So if I'm a person with a disability and I register for, let's stick with the karate example, the competitive 5th level karate program, then, and I ask for a modification, maybe it's a sign language interpreter, then that's where the assessment should occur to determine how to blend the interpreter in with my lack of hearing and the activities that I'm expected to do in the program. Does that help?
yeah, it does. I mean, that's true for anyone, right? Like I wouldn't be able to go and do level 5 karate, right? So that's the distinction, you know, but for, as appropriate, the level. You know, the way this is worded, town must make programs available in the most integrated setting. That kind of, you know, as long as it's appropriate at the level that.
Well, later
It's
on
being
in the
requested.
fine print,
uh,
the Department of Justice does say that you can have prerequisite skill requirements. So for example, I do not know how to swim. So I would be a bad registrant in a canoe class or a kayaking class. Don't let me in there. But how are you going to know that I don't know how to swim unless you ask questions related to my skill level? So that's not discriminatory. If I happen to also have a seizure disorder and don't know how to swim, you're not discriminating against me because I might have a seizure disorder. You're discriminating against me because I don't know how to swim and I'm unsafe in a kayak. So some, gosh, I hate to use this word, but some common sense approach in the assessment is really important. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the way the Department of Justice defines programs. This is kind of an unusual way to approach it, but for a lot of us, the idea of a program is something like a karate class. You register for it, it meets on, what is it, Monday? It meets on Mondays at 6:30 to 7. For 8 weeks, you pay $75 for it. That's not what the Department of Justice thinks the program is. The Department of Justice says a program is sidewalks. The Supreme Court has agreed twice on that. Sports fields are a program. Public comment at a town board meeting is a program. Sports fields are a program. Karate is a program. So we like to define it, and in our work with the town, we will define programs as an opportunity that the town makes available. So I think on our way here, we passed a Subway sandwich place. If I want to grab a Subway sandwich and sit down at a picnic table in a park and eat my lunch, having picnic tables there is a program of the town. DOJ also makes it clear, though, that not necessarily every existing facility has to be made accessible. Instead, the approach is that every program in the facility has to be accessible. So using the example I just used of having my lunch at a picnic table, that doesn't mean that every picnic table has to be made accessible. It means that at each park, or maybe in most parks, there should be tables that are acceptable. And certainly communication is a key part of this. So one of our other recommendations to the town will be to make sure that the town website talks about which locations have acceptable playgrounds, picnic tables, and so forth. You asked an earlier question, and it kind of ties into the fourth bullet point here. If you call the Department of Justice tomorrow and ask them how soon the town has to make the transition plan work occur, they'll say as soon as is possible, which really isn't helpful from a planning perspective. So typically for our work, for a town where the work includes public right of way like sidewalks, we're gonna be looking at somewhere between a 9-year schedule and maybe a 15-year schedule. It varies from each town. We're not there yet because we're not even finished with year 1 right now. But that's probably a fair early approach to have. On the next slide, we just talk a little bit about why audit facilities, and I'll let the cat out of the bag, the answer's at the bottom, it's just the right thing to do. The town wants to make sure that people with disabilities enjoy the same beautiful parks and beautiful facilities that people who do not have disabilities get to take advantage of. So that's the real reason why. The other reason,
15 years later,
pardon?
just 15 years later.
Well, not necessarily. A lot of the work will occur. We're gonna talk about some of the factors coming up, and I think you'll see that the things that get put off to 15 years, if that's what we wind up with. are gonna be the most costly and most complex types of changes. There's a whole lot of other work that can occur between now and then. And we are right at that section. Anyway, in the next. Actually, in the next slide, the WT process. So we use pretty simple tools, I don't know why, can you hold your cell phone up just so I can use it as a PowerPoint? So our cell phones have an app that download the federal standards and then the Colorado requirements. And then in the field, we create checklists.
Yeah.
And we also customize the checklist based on our experience. I served on 3 federal advisory committees that wrote the federal standards. I trained the Department of Justice enforcement staff. So we know how local government sites operate. So that's what we've also included in the smart practices that we use. We use pretty simple tools, a 2-foot digital level, a tape measure, a door pressure gauge, a smartphone, and a smart team lead. And I'm not gonna say that this work is rocket science. But if NASA uses checklists, and if a brain surgeon uses checklists, I'm all on board with that. And so we too use checklists. There's nothing wrong with using checklists. So a little bit more about the transition plan. Again, the effort is to make the programs of the town accessible. The key part is to disperse the access retrofits so that no matter where I am in the town of Erie, I'll have access to something that I can use. There is pretty good guidance from the Department of Justice on unique sites. If there is only one of a certain type of site, like we mentioned the pump track when we were talking earlier. You can't move pump track activities to another location. You can't hold it at a location that's not accessible. So that means the pump track entrance winds up being made accessible if it's not already. For recurring sites, so in other words, for playgrounds, if there are multiples of a type of playground, I'm just gonna make up a number here, if there are 9 playgrounds, is making one playground accessible the right approach? We think no. Is making all 9 fully accessible the right approach? We don't think it's necessary. There may be other competing priorities. So we recommend, and this will be in our deliverables for the town, a minimum of 1 of 3 of recurring assets. And then again, the key question is stretched out over how many years? So we've had communities tell us they want to stretch it out longer. We've had communities tell us they want to condense everything to a shorter number of years. So that'll be a 2025 discussion.
A clarifying question, so when we're saying accessible, are you using that term kind of interchangeable with ADA compliant? Or are we talking real accessibility, like you access and you can use the playground as an example, that you just access and you're in mulch and then you can't, you know what I mean, like when you say accessible, do we mean ADA compliant, or do we really mean truly accessible for the people to use it?
It's both. So the smart practices that we talk about, engineered wood fiber as a playground surface today is compliant if 4 conditions are met. 1, it has to be replenished when it goes home in kids' shoes, shirts, socks, and shorts. 2, it has to be raked level. Everybody does those 2. 3 is it has to be wet. And 4, it has to be compacted. If those 4 things don't occur, then engineered wood fiber is not an acceptable surface. It also has to be certified by the manufacturer through a third-party testing lab as an acceptable design, but that's done in the lab. A playground is not a lab. It's a wild, free-form place where kids run and push each other and sit down and play in the surface. So is engineered wood fiber, does it have the potential to be an acceptable surface? Absolutely. Are there other surfaces that are more accessible and more usable? Absolutely. So when we get to surface discussions with the town, we'll talk about that. We've developed a comparison of the different surface types. So again, as a smart practice, we're gonna lean more towards surfaces that are more used. There are several factors in the next slide, next 3 slides, actually, I think, that other jurisdictions like the town have said, hey, we think that that's an important piece for us, and we want to use that as a filter to help us decide in what order we're going to make sites change. So the first is the severity of the barrier. I mentioned public right of way earlier. We will frequently see in some communities that the east side of the street in a block has a sidewalk, but the west side doesn't. So that's an extreme barrier. If I use a mobility device and I buy a house on the west side of that block, grass and dirt are never an accessible surface. So that's an extreme barrier, and many jurisdictions have made that kind of barrier a very high priority for retrofit. On the flip side, many have made low-hanging fruit a high priority too. Those often require staff training or greater staff awareness. They're, I'm going to say, easy to do if they are well understood. Another popular one has been pick the most frequently used site and make it a higher priority. So that might be the park here adjacent to this building, or it might be another park. So we're certainly going to ask the town, give us the top 5 sites as far as frequency of use. At the bottom bullet point on this slide, many towns have told us, hey, we know that employees who acquire a disability or who have a disability are going to be treated under Title I by us, the employer of the town. But for our transition plan, we'd rather devote the resources to public spaces as opposed to employee spaces. So that's become a popular factor as well. On the next slide, the top bullet point talks about the recency of construction. This is important because if it was new design, and new design is defined as anything after March 15 of 2012. So if it was new design and construction, then it had to fully comply. And so if it doesn't, it's non-compliant because it wasn't consistent with the design standards. So that should be the higher priority for retrofit as well. I don't think that this one is so much of an issue here, but certainly repurposed sites. Almost every Parks and Recreation department winds up getting the 50 or 60 or 70-year-old school building that they can't use for education purposes anymore. It becomes the community center. 60-year-old building is really hard to retrofit for access, but I don't think that we have anything like that in our inventory.
Town hall.
Town hall.
Yep.
We'll skip right over that. Also, many jurisdictions have a partner with either a county or a private business or a nonprofit. Usually when there's a partnership, it takes a little bit longer to figure out what year you're going to make the changes in, and then also importantly, who's going to pay for which portion of the change. I mentioned complex or costly retrofits earlier. These are retrofits that are almost a rebuild, so it takes time for the jurisdiction to build up the resources to affect the change. Last but not least, on the next slide, other transition plan factors, sites that are not yet subject to a design standard. So the federal standards do not yet address trails, campsites, picnic areas, viewing areas, beaches, constructed park assets like a grill, for example, a fire pit in a park, and I'll stop there. That should have been issued in the early 2000s, and it hasn't for a number of reasons. So a number of states have decided to just address this on their own. Texas is the most recent. In October, Texas will adopt the pending federal guidance as part of their accessibility standard. Illinois has already done so, did it in 2018. New Jersey has done so, Massachusetts has adopted some parts of it. California has adopted some parts of it. So my own belief is that this will become more of a state issue, and the state will eventually pick this up. Historic sites are not exempt. They do have to be evaluated. You can make decisions about what type of retrofit you'll make at a historic site, especially if the retrofit would threaten or destroy the historic significance of the site. Also, sites that have other protections, like for endangered flora and fauna or endangered species, those are protected as well and do not have to meet the technical requirements of those sites. Last but not least, sometimes compliance might be technically infeasible. I'm not an architect, but I think that's a load-bearing element of the building. If for some reason we had to move a load-bearing wall or element, you do not have to do that. And that asset can remain as is, even if it is inaccessible. Just to give you a sense of some of the things that we saw when we audited the parks and facilities, Tatum Story, who's the project manager for this job, is going to come up and tackle this next.
Right.
And I won't be far away.
So as John mentioned, we did the audits last year. We actually have more to come in the next couple months. We're gonna do trails and stuff like that after the weather breaks. So for our first observation, we're gonna talk about parking. Parking, every park has parking, and so it's something that it has stringent requirements, and if you think about it, it's really the first element a person really uses when they go to a park, so it's really important. In terms of the requirements, parking stalls cannot exceed 2.08% in any direction in terms of sloping. And so here at Coal Miner Park, you're seeing there was a 5.2% slope in the access aisle. There are lots of requirements with parking. Another one is that signage needs to be mounted. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the parking signs that you see at accessible stalls. This one here is missing it. The sign should be mounted 60 inches above ground level, which would be it wouldn't be at the curb. You want to measure from like the actual parking stall. So
Tatum, can I jump in on parking?
please.
Also, in some jurisdictions, this is a good question for the town staff. Law enforcement will not enforce accessible parking violations if it is signed improperly. So we hear that from more and more localities. So that's a thing that we'll put in our report to you at the end of this year, this first year, as a suggestion / recommendation.
Perfect, thanks.
It can be kind of confusing too, as somebody who would use one of these to not have the sign, because we see a lot of times in other places where they've repurposed accessible stalls to be standard stalls, but you can kind of still see the remnants of the paint, and so it's just really good to have the signage.
On the next slide.
The next slide is about accessible routes. This is another very important thing in terms of getting to the park or to the assets. Over here at Columbine Mine Park, there was a change in level near the bleachers. Changes in levels on the accessible route can't exceed 0.25 inches. And then at Long's Peak Park, there was surface deterioration. And we see this on all surfaces. That's why it's really important to maintain your surfaces and make sure that somebody in a wheelchair doesn't get their wheels stuck in a deteriorated path. Here we're looking at park elements. The drinking fountains need to have a high bowl and a low bowl. The low bowl should have 27 inches knee clearance minimum. So if you're thinking of where the bowl would be mounted, you want 27 inches from the ground to the bottom of the bowl. And then the spigot for the lower bowl needs to be 36 inches max from the ground. So the issue here was that this one was just too low. Somebody with a wheelchair couldn't get under it. And then at Clayton Park, there was a dog dispenser that was mounted too high. So max heights for operable parts is 48 inches max. One item's to be mounted 15 to 48 inches from the ground. A good example is like the coat rack that's behind Lori, that's something, to me, it maybe looks high, we have to take a measurement or look at the report here, but. That's an example of an operable part. If this was a pull down, display screen, you'd wanna have either a string or something that was in the reach range of 48 to 15 from the ground.
And for the coat rack, if it is higher than 48, it doesn't mean that you have to take it down. It maybe means put another one up that is at 48.
Yeah, we see this a lot in restrooms where it's funny, the accessible stall will have a coat rack that's extremely high, and you're like, this is the one place it should definitely be low, but. Next up.
Trying.
All right, so parks and play areas, so designated entries in general. The designated entry is kind of an entry to a play area that's designated, rather than it just being a continuous border. So if you're thinking of like a sidewalk and then it's just a continuous border where the mulch begins or the EWF begins. A designated entry is a smart practice, but it's a great smart practice. If you have one, it needs to be accessible, and in this instance, it was too narrow. So the designated entry should be 60 inches if you have one. And then over here, we have a transfer platform. So people with disabilities who use wheelchairs would typically come to a parallel approach to the transfer platform at a play area. And the transfer platform should be measured 11 to 18 inches from the ground, so that they can transfer onto it and use the play components. This one in this instance was just a bit too low. Portable restrooms, so, portable restrooms are an interesting one. Because usually they come either designed perfect, or they'll come and they'll say that they're accessible, but they aren't necessarily there, so it's always interesting to, audit these, so this.
We have heard of some restroom manufacturers that say that their portable restroom is accessible, and then they have another brand line that's ADA compliant. But it's kind of a marketing trick.
Yeah.
That we would urge you to be careful about.
Yeah, cautious of. So this one, in general, this is even beyond just portable restrooms. Elements can't project from the wall greater than 4 inches. So if you're thinking of the paper towel dispenser over there, it's okay because it's over that cabinet. But if it was just loose right here on the wall, and it projected greater than 4 inches, then it would be a deficit here in this room. And the reasoning for that is for somebody who uses a cane for seeing, they might run into it. Their cane probably wouldn't detect it. The requirements for that projection are between 27 inches and 80 inches from the ground. You can't have anything projecting greater than 4 inches. The other issue that was here at this restroom was that there was a slope on the surface. So this can maybe be fixed by relocating the stall. It looks like this was kind of built around it, so this may be like a constructed element specifically for a stall, so it may require repaving and correcting that slope issue. But entryways into restrooms, they need to have the 2.08% slope in any direction as well. That's through doors or whatever it may be, entryway wise. So outdoor construction, oh no, we're trying this one. Restrooms, continuing on. The grab bars need to be mounted max 36 inches from the ground, and you're measuring to the top of the grab bar. And in this instance, they were just a little bit over 1.5 inches. And so that's an easy, simple fix. That's when he was talking about low hanging fruit. A lot of times those are things that can be fixed pretty quick rather than taking 15 years to do. And then here's another operable part that we're seeing here, this syringe dispenser. The part that you put the syringe in is just mounted too high. It's 61.25. It needs to be max 48 in the ground so that someone with a disability can reach and use the part. Okay, so next up are these picnic tables. The picnic tables here just lack wheelchair space. So I'm sure you all have seen the wheelchair accessible or the wheelchair design picnic tables that kind of have the longer putouts on the end. The measurements for it are that it needs to be 27 inches from the ground for that knee clearance. It needs to have 18-inch knee depth so that somebody can roll under it and use it. And then if it's gonna be mounted, this is the big problem that we see all the time is they'll have wheelchair accessible picnic tables, but they'll be in the corner so that somebody in a wheelchair actually can't get to the end. That's the usable portion. So a lot of times we're recommending to make sure that you're conscious and aware of providing a 36-inch path to the area.
It's a month.
And then, we'll talk about benches really quick, sorry.
Sorry.
It's okay. So benches need 30 by 48 clear floor space for somebody in a wheelchair to sit and talk to somebody else that's on a bench. They don't necessarily have to have the ability to transfer onto the bench. They just need kind of like a parking space so that if they're, going on a walk with a friend and they want to sit down at the bench, they need that clear floor space. In this instance, it does look like there is a lot, but because it's like part of the walkway, you need an additional 36 inches for passing space. Because if somebody was parked here, they'd obstruct the accessible route.
So just a little more concrete.
Just a little more close, yeah. A lot of times we'll see design where they have, like, see the bench, how it's kind of in the center of the platform. Sometimes if you scoot it over and there's 30 inches there, it can kind of give you the depth and you'll get the inches. All right, and then as I mentioned, we still have trails to audit, and I know that there are concrete and crusher fine trails here, so this is definitely not a representation of everything that Erie offers. But as John mentioned earlier, dirt and grass and gravel are not an accessible surface and never will be. We do audit trails that are of crusher fine or crushed granite or crushed stone, and if that's maintained well enough, then it is accessible. But the ones that we observed so far were dirt and inaccessible surface. And unique sites, this is the fun one. So you guys have a Ninja Warrior course, and it looks pretty cool. And I know that there were a lot of ground level components that somebody in a wheelchair could probably use. The only issues that we really saw were that there were slopes and the clear floor space for some of the play areas, and even just like the route through the surface had some slopage. So there was a 5.9% slope, which if it's a running slope, it can get up to 5% on an accessible route. So depending on it's kind of hard to see because of the shadow, but depending on whichever route it was, if we were really off or 0.9 off. And then Star Meadows Park, when we saw this, we were like, what are these things? Yeah, slackline posts. So this was our first time auditing a slackline post. Pretty cool that you guys have these. But at least one of them, I think there were 2 sets at the park. One of them would need to have a route that would connect from the sidewalk or however you get through the park to both ends of them, because if somebody's setting it up, they're gonna have to hit both ends of the park. Or the poles. And then dispersion. So one of my colleagues audited the Coal Miner Park, and he said that while he was there were a lot of disability groups and special needs groups at this park. He said it was almost tricky to audit because trying not to get photos of children, and they were just everywhere. But he mentioned, and I kind of looked at the map and saw that this park's located in the older downtown area near the schools, but there's not many other parks of its type around the area. And because he saw a lot of disability groups, this is something that, if this is a park that's frequently used, especially by people with disabilities, it may, depending on conversations with staff and with the community, be something that could be prioritized at a higher rate than maybe another park. There were route issues, like the gaps, lack of route to the site from parking, that's really important. And then the playground itself is pretty old in terms of like what we saw everywhere else.
So that's a peek at what we saw in the park and facility audits, and the next part of this is where we start to explore what the community's preferences are. You know, do you have an order in mind for how the town should address this? Is it based on the type of assets? Is it based on locations, based on busiest sites? So on the next slide, some of those are up there, so we have here. You have a thought about what should be a higher priority and what can be a later priority.
So, so I don't think I mentioned that in the introductions, but I am a parent of a child with a disability, so this kinda is, you know, hits home in many ways, but also on a professional level, I work, you know, in the disability realm, so, and one thing is, like, there are not, and that's why, you know, I got a little sensitive when we're talking timeline, because it's like, you know, I mean, my child will be in her 20s by the time that she can enjoy a park or go for a walk, but some of these, I mean, from our perspective, I mean, Erie is, we love the town, and that's why I'm here, because I want this to be our town, you know, and accessible, and have all the aspect that makes it work for families like ours. But one thing is, there's not always options, you know, so maybe even having like one really good usable option versus like little bits and pieces everywhere, right? So it's like back to our playground conversation, like it's accessible, but you also can go in and you can actually use fixtures and things like that, at least going forward. I realize, you know, retrofits are harder, but the town is growing so much, and ADA compliance is a great first start, and I'm, you know, glad we're having this conversation, but how do we take it to the next step, right? So it's not just, we don't stop at, okay, we met 1 to 5, but then my child is still not able to, she has no swings or fixtures she can use to play with, you know, so take it to that next level. So, like from our perspective, having like places where they're really fully accessible and like in their intent purposes versus like little things here and there would make a difference. Because now you can go someplace and really enjoy many aspects of a park or a trail versus, you know, the one swing that is a bit, you know, so that would be like the first thought that comes to mind in terms of priorities, kind of focusing and making something work end to end. Otherwise, I mean, Colorado is an outdoor state, so anything that can enable that being part of that would be amazing, you know, and I mean, and like cracks, all these make it really hard, like try just live a life in a wheelchair for a day and you'll see what it takes, you know, to maneuver even a 10-year-old around in the wheelchair is a lot of work, so.
Well, let me ask you a couple
Yeah.
of questions. Lori, can you go to the next slide? We know from our own experiences with disability and from our client towns and cities and counties and states experiences, that families who have a family member with a disability spend much more time researching the site so that they can figure out if it's accessible. Do you see something on this slide that resonates with you? We tend to hear from the communities, I want you to start with basics. If I can't park there, and if there's a constructed restroom and it's not accessible, I'm not gonna go back to that park. Or would you rather have the thing that draws people to the park, the trail, the playground? Do you think that should be a higher priority than parking the restroom?
Yeah, I can kind of give a little example. I worked with some of the guys here at the rec center for making the ice rink accessible to the community and kind of making you know, a ramp, equipment, whatever that took, but also like specialized low sensory events that would be there. And part of that, I went back and kind of got feedback from the community of like, what, you know, if if you were to go enjoy the ice cream for a day, what would you need? And this is the kind of stuff that came up. Am I gonna be able to park? Is there a restroom with a, older children changing table that I can use? Yeah, this was the kind of questions that were brought up. Yes, we can access that, but that's gonna be a very short outing if suddenly, we have to access like a changing table and it's not available, or we get there and there's nowhere to park. So it was these kind of things, that really support, again, spending more time at the venue.
Well, and that's a perfect example, 5-year-old who use a wheelchair grow up to be 25-year-olds who
Exactly.
use a wheelchair, so. The fold down thing as a changing table, that's not gonna work, and so many of the families that we talk to wind up with their
The
child
back floor.
on the floor.
Yeah, unacceptable,
So,
right? You
a lot
wouldn't
of
want that for your
states-
child.
A lot of states have addressed that, I mentioned Texas earlier, Illinois, Massachusetts, and a handful of others are requiring, at least in new construction today.
Yeah.
And this will start in Texas in the fall, that they're requiring new construction, that there be an adult size changing table. We've also had other municipalities say, we've got a talented team on our staff, we can build a wooden changing table and put it in the restroom if there's room. You just need to tell us what the dimensions are. So there are a lot of approaches like that that can, address that particular issue. One of the other things that you talked about is this bottom bullet point up here. Would you prefer one site to have everything made accessible before I move on to another park or another facility? Or would you prefer sports fields accessible here, playgrounds accessible here? Whatever, the trail accessible there
Yeah,
at different locations.
yeah, so actually we did another roundtable about accessible playgrounds in the community, and that's one of the feedback that was brought up from that was that the community would rather have, and that was in preparation for the two parks.
But I was trying to pull up. Compass,
Yeah,
'cause I know
yeah,
that
Compass,
we're-
yeah, working Compass, Luke and his team, but some of the feedback from the community that we received is like they would rather have a place with multiple things that they can do versus one-offs, right? Because now they can go and like spend an hour at a place because, they can go for a walk, and then if the child, if they have a child that is age appropriate, use the equipment to play at the playground, and but also having the bathrooms and everything else to support that spending a longer time there. So, it makes a big difference in terms of, the experience, but at the same time, if you're trying to get somewhere else and you can't park or get over the sidewalk, or, that's also important, so.
So in a perfect world, we want some kind of a hybrid of
Yeah,
these and other things.
yeah, maybe, have like one or two sites where that focus is that true inclusion, and when you're saying accessible, like, that's the nuance I was trying to understand, that when we're saying accessible, is that really usable, or you just access and you're sitting there watching the kids do things from closer, right? So, so having like maybe even one site in the community that provides that full experience, but then be able to kind of access aspects of other sites.
Who is we that got together for the accessible playground?
Yeah, I reached out to our disability community, and we had about 30 families sign up, and we did 2 roundtables with the town of Erie and the designers. Well, not town of Erie, the guys at the community center that are leading the project. And that's the kind of feedback that was provided.
I mentioned at the beginning that we're gonna follow this up with a survey, likely in English and in Spanish. would you be willing to help
Absolutely.
distribute that?
Absolutely, same for these events, happy to kind of promote them beforehand and get more people here. So you don't wanna hear my voice all the time.
You've made
Great,
great
that
progress.
would make great.
Before you leave, can we get your contact?
Oh,
info, please?
absolutely.
Thank you.
You made really good comments, so it's been amazing.
Thank
Do staff have any questions? Do you have any other comments in general about the process?
I mean, the only thing again, I mean, I don't live on a cloud, I realize resources and time and money and all that, you know, I understand all that, but it's important to me with a sense of urgency when it comes to things like this, because it's really quality of life for a lot of families in our community. The isolation, the not being able to participate, all these are like top concerns of families with children with disabilities or adults with disabilities, and having opportunities to kind of be included in the community is important, right? And again, we love Erie, we love everyone we talk to goes far and beyond, so I'm not here, this is not meant to be a complaint by any chance, but really kind of pushing for that sense of urgency to get these things in place, you know, so we're, you know, we're doing that now for all children, and then for anything new going forward, really have that front and center. There's no reason to have new designs that not all people can use. There's really no reason for that. You know, we'd rather less things if money is an issue, but usable. Anyway, so that's really, I'm happy to be kind of part of this conversation at any capacity and pull people together.
Great. Well, we appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you, if not tomorrow, but certainly seeing your hand involved in the distribution of the survey and the promotion.
Absolutely happy.
Tim, anything from you?
I can think of it now.
Lori, I think that's about a wrap then for this first meeting. We have another one scheduled tomorrow at 11:30. And
They've already checked the Zoom link for tomorrow. It works.
Good, and I'll share that on our,
Thank
at
you.
least the families can join remotely, I'll share in the
That'd be great.
disability forums.
And we'll be posting the recording for anyone who couldn't join because of the technical difficulties, so.
Sounds good.
thanks a lot, Gerald.
Thank you, everyone, appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Alberto.
Oh, that's all.
I think it's just water savings in case.